Hello and welcome. In our last presentation on the airport slot basics, we mentioned a calendar of activities related to seasonal preparation and deadlines. Now in this presentation, we will be unpacking that calendar as well as the responsibilities between airport slot coordinator and the operator in terms of seasonal preparation. Let's start with the seasons. It's important to understand the seasons because the calendar is linked to seasons, the deadlines are linked to seasons as well, and the preparation towards a new season starts months in advance. Now there's two scheduling seasons, a summer and a winter, according to the IATA WSG. And this is for the purpose of planning. So there's a description here of how to calculate the start and end dates. But let's look at winter 20 because that's the season we are currently preparing for, that's starting in October. So this will start on the last Sunday in October. That's the 25th of October 2020 and ends on the last Saturday before the last Sunday in March, which is the 27th of March. Remember as well, historic rights are calculated on one season and carry over to the next equivalent season. So as an example, we're preparing for winter 20. So the historics or 80-20 rule were applied on the winter 19 slot performance. This is what the calendar looks like. Now, I'm sure you've come across this at some point or another. This specific calendar was revised, which is why you'll see some red highlights in there. This is because due to COVID-19, the IATA slot conference has been cancelled in June. However, you will notice that the rest of the deadlines are still in force. I've included the link here as well for this calendar. So you've received an SHL message. What now? Well, the first indication that seasonal preparation and a calendar is in force is this SHL from the slot coordinator, because this tells us now that there are deadlines coming up for the operator as well. So this SHL message gives the operator an indication of what their historic slots are for the winter 20 season. This is based on the 80-20 calculation of winter 19 performance. In this SHL message, you will find lines with the prefix H and U, H being the slots that made the 80-20 and qualify for historics, and U being those that did not qualify. Remember, this SHL message itself with the H and U lines will form the foundation of your initial submission, which we will discuss later on. Just to recap that 80-20 rule we mentioned, if you've used the series of slots that you've booked in winter 19 for at least 80% of the period booked, then you would qualify for the historic in winter 20. Now, when I say used, it means there are specific parameters that are used to calculate this, and the coordinator will advise. The result table that the South African slot coordinator attaches to this SHL message is also valuable because it contains statistical information of how these flights performed and how they were monitored. Now, if you check this very carefully, it will help you with some ideas and proactive measures even of what you can do better in the next season. Also important here is if you've lost a slot that you believe you should have gained, then the next deadline is for you. So the Agree Historics deadline for the winter 20 season is the 7th of May 2020. Unfortunately, if you're watching this after that deadline, then you've missed it. But it's still important for us to go through understanding this deadline because all these deadlines that we're talking about for winter 20 are the same activities that will take place in preparation for any season. So what is this agree historics deadline? If you've lost a historic that you believe you should have gained, then as an operator, you are allowed to raise this query with the coordinator. It's important to be very clear and concise in the query and to have reliable data as an operator to substantiate why you believe you should have gained this historic. Now, it's important to raise this dispute with enough time for the coordinator to investigate your query and then respond to you as an operator before the 7th or on the 7th of May. This brings us to our next deadline, which is the initial submission. So even if you've missed the agree historics, you can still make your initial submissions. Let's look at the initial submission deadline, 14th of May for the winter 20 season. A critical deadline for operators because this submission will contain the slot request for winter 20. This means you will use the historics you've gained or lost and formulate your request that needs to be submitted to the coordinator. The request needs to contain your intention with the historics you've gained. Either you're keeping them or you're changing them. You can ask for new slots or you can release slots. Now remember, in this specific request during the initial submission period, there are some codes that are not normally used outside of the initial submissions. The coordinator then takes all the initial submissions that they have received by the deadline and starts to allocate slots. There's priorities that are predefined that this coordinator would use if there are any airlines that are competing for the same slot. Remember, historics get #1 priority. So why is this deadline important? Of course, if you miss the deadline, then it means you've not submitted any slots for the new season, or if you submit it late, you will probably be considered, but not with all the operators, but after all the operators have been completed. So you would get the lowest priority. Remember, I mentioned historics get high priority. So even if you've gained the historic, you've now lost the priority that you've gotten by missing this deadline. So there are a few challenges and risks that I've identified. One being manual submission. If you are submitting manually, give yourself enough time to check and recheck that everything is correct. Make sure your codes and formats are also correct. If you are using a find and replace on your H's and U's, then it means you've not checked your slot request matches with what you actually require for the new season. This can cause an issue. Missing the deadline, once again, I've already discussed how that can impact you. So we've mentioned earlier that the initial submissions that are received by the coordinator by the deadline are then all used to allocate slots. So the slot allocation list, or SAL, is basically the response from the coordinator or the results of what was allocated according to the initial submissions. So an SAL will contain all the slots that have been granted for the operator and the alternate offers if a slot was not available. Why is this important? Of course, in June already, which is the deadline for the coordinator, the operator will have an idea of what their slot allocations are and what they're holding for the new season. Now, this gives ample time for two things. One is to amend or look for improvements or even swaps with the coordinator. Two is the series return deadline. So the series return deadline offers an opportunity to all operators to return slots that they may not need or will not need for the new season. So as a reward, if I can call it that, for returning these series of slots, when the new season does start and there are calculations that are starting according to the 80-20 rule that's going to be calculated in that season. All the slots that were returned by the deadline will not count against the operator. So remember, this 80-20 rule we spoke about much earlier in the SHL discussion is calculated over a full season to give you historics for the next season. So winter 20's calculations will count to winter 21's SHLs. Now, I'm saying that if you return your slots by the series return deadline before winter 20 starts, when the calculation starts, then all the slots that were returned by that deadline will not count in that 80-20 calculation. So you don't get a minus or a negative for the slots that were cancelled. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on the calendar. Please feel free to contact us directly if you require any assistance. Thank you. Goodbye.